Hello. Today's unit we will be talking about the digestive system. So I'm going to go ahead and get that PowerPoint pulled up here. Here we go. So again, this is lecture 14, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so when we think about what is the digestive system? Again, it's important for us to understand its kind of general overall function. Certainly, we understand that nutrition is going to be really important for our overall health status, mental, emotional states, as well as our sense of well-being. Also, we think about risk of chronic disease and some of those factors. Nutrition plays a really important role. But what we're going to focus on today is not necessarily the foods that we're consuming, but how we can break those foods down so that they can be utilized as energy. So digestion allows us to take food, break it down into a usable energy form, which is known as ATP within the human body. So again, that's kind of the most fundamental or basic unit of energy measurement. So we have kind of two different categories of organs that we'll be looking at today. So we have the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, also known as the alimentary canal. And this is basically the path through which the food will travel. So again, we'll have the food enter through the mouth. It travels through a common area known as the pharynx. And again, that'll be a common area with the respiratory center as well. Then it'll travel down the esophagus into the stomach, small intestines, which has three different components, the large intestines, and then any waste product will be removed through the anus. Okay, so again, these are the organs that food travels through in this appropriate order, okay, or sequence. We also have some things that are known as accessory organs. And these accessory organs are going to assist in the process of digestion. So they're not necessarily like a tube that the food will flow through. However, they're going to contribute to those digestive processes in one way or another. Okay. So digestion involves taking in 6 different types of nutrients. And again, those of you who've already taken a nutrition class would know those 6 nutrients to be carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals, vitamins, and also water as well. Okay, so we're going to both mechanically and chemically break those down, absorb them, and then utilize them within the body's tissues. So again, the difference between digestion and absorption, digestion is simply breaking those products down. Absorption involves us moving those food particles from in this digestive tract that we just talked about and into the bloodstream so that they can be utilized as that energy that we talked about. Okay, and that process of metabolism and absorption and those types of factors will be discussed in Bio 226 or in Anatomy and Physiology 2 if you're taking both courses within this sequence. Okay, so again, if I were to give these accessory organs kind of a definition, I would say that they lie external to and are connected to the GI canal by ducts and contribute in some way to the breakdown of food. Okay. 6 essential food processing activities that need to occur in order for digestion to work out. Number 1, ingestion. So taking food into your mouth. So we got to put it in our mouth. That's step 1. Number 2 is propulsion, and this is the movement of the food through the GI tract. So we have to have some way to make that food continue to move in kind of a unidirectional manner, which means that it's continuing to move forward through those pathways that we mentioned in the previous slide. Number 3 is mechanical digestion. And this is breaking down food into smaller pieces via enzymes. Number 4 is chemical digestion. And this is when we take complex foods composed of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and they're going to be broken down into their chemical building blocks. Okay, so proteins, think of a protein as a strand of beads, okay? And within that strand of beads, each individual bead represents one amino acid. There are like 20 different amino acids that we can have, and we can order them in different ways. We can have different numbers of you know, certain amino acids, so you can have a lot of one particular type and not any of another type, etc. So again, if you think about, there's 20 different options for beads available. How could I strand them together? Can vary really exponentially depending on how long that strand is. So when we think about chemical digestion, again, we're going to break down protein, for example, into its building block, which is an amino acid, one single amino acid. Okay. When we think about carbohydrates, again, carbohydrates are made up of chains of simple sugars. So I want to break down this chain of many sugars into single sugars. And the most simple sugars that I have are known as galactose, glucose, and fructose. So I can break those down into any, you know, those appropriate three monosaccharides or simple sugars. Okay. With fats, again, a long strand of fat or one molecule of fat is known as a triglyceride, and I can break that down into a glycerol and 3 fatty acid tails. So again, when we think about the chemical breakdown, just keep in mind that we're taking those long chains of food and we're breaking them into a more simple or their most simplistic form, depending on what that nutrient is. So that's number 4. Number 5 is absorption. So that's transporting nutrients from inside the GI tract into the blood so that we can disperse them amongst the body or process them by taking them to the liver. Okay, so that's number 5. Number 6, defecation or elimination of waste products through feces. So again, regardless of what we've consumed, we are going to produce some level of waste. And so we need to get rid of that regularly in order to not allow that to become toxic within the body. Okay, so here you can see the peritoneal canal or cavity. And when we think about what does this word mean, we're looking at the digestive cavity. So again, this kind of lower thoracic area. Okay, and we've got 2 different serous layers within this particular section of the body. We have the parietal peritoneum, which you can see here in red. Again, if you remember back to lecture 1, the parietal is the parent, so he's the most superficial in nature. And then the visceral peritoneum is going to then surround each individual organ. Okay. So again, this is located within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Visceral peritoneum covers each individual organ. So again, you can see kind of this blue line surrounding these little organs here. And then that parietal peritoneum is covering the entire cavity. So notice that each individual organ is not covered by their own parietal peritoneum. It's just one big parietal peritoneum surrounding the whole big shebang. Again, when we think about the function of this system, that's pretty important because, again, if I have a bunch of food here in my stomach is going to grow really large, but then that food is going to travel into the small intestines. And so I'm going to shift that volume to just another section of this tube pathway, essentially. So it makes sense that we have kind of one parietal layer surrounding the entire system as opposed to each individual organ. Why do we need these serous layers? It's going to allow digestive organs to glide easily along one another during these digestive processes. So again, keep in mind the amount of expansibility, is that a word? The level to which we can expand our stomach or intestines and those types of things is pretty substantial. So it's important that we have this serous layer so that things can slide easily. Again, we kind of already touched on this a little bit, but again, if we're to think about the flow of food through the GI tract or through the alimentary canal, here you can see how things are flowing. Again, one thing I would point out that sometimes trips people up, notice these little arrows. So you're going to move from esophagus to stomach, down to the small intestines, then over to the large intestines, and then finally out the anus. So the stomach has more regions than this. These are the two that I kind of chose to focus on. We've got the cardiac region, the pyloric region. Then the order in which we'll move through the small intestines is we'll move from the pyloric region of the stomach through the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, then into the large intestines where they will travel through the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then finally out the anus. So let's take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. First thing we want to do is kind of zoom in on the wall of the digestive tract and have a look at this from a histological standpoint. So when we think about the walls of the GI tract, there are 4 different layers. We have a mucosa layer, which is our most internal layer. Next, we have a submucosa. Next, we have a muscular layer known as muscularis externa. And then lastly, the most superficial of the layers is the serosa, which can be seen here kind of in green. So let's start with the mucosa. So again, we're starting with our most internal of the layers. And again, the mucosa can be broken down into three sublayers. So again, you can see those here. We have the epithelium, which is our most internal, lamina propria, which is in the middle, and then muscularis mucosa here. So again, the accumulation of these 3 layers is equivalent to the mucosa, and that's what that says here. I know you can't read it because it's super blurry. Okay. So let's take a look at what's going on within these. Epithelium layer helps to absorb nutrients and secrete mucus. Again, mucus is super important within the digestive tracts because it'll allow us to have the food move without abrasion to the walls of the tract. Okay. Lamina propria is made of loose connective tissue, and this also contains capillaries that are going to nourish the lining. Okay, so they're going to nourish the epithelium, for example, so that this tissue can maintain its metabolism. Because again, think about how much food we eat and how much work this tissue must do in order to keep up with its function. So again, if we're eating, 3-5 times a day or whatever, we need this system to be highly active. Lastly, we have the muscularis mucosa, and this is a thin layer of smooth muscle that's going to help with the movement of food. It's going to help in a process known as peristalsis, which we'll talk about soon. Okay. Next, we're moving to submucosa. So again, here with the mucosa that we just talked about, we had the epithelium layer, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Now we're moving to layer number 2 through the submucosa. This layer is made of loose areolar and dense irregular connective tissue, contains blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, also has some elastic fibers that's going to allow us to have a great amount of expanding capacity so that this layer can return to its resting position once food passes through. But again, we can have a great amount of growth depending on the volume of food or fluid that we're consuming. Next layer you can see is the muscularis externa, also known as the muscularis, and this is made of 2 layers of smooth muscle. We have a circular muscle layer, which you can see here, and we also have a longitudinal layer, which you can see just superficial to that. Okay, so again, your 2 layers are circular and longitudinal, and they're going to work together in order to perform a task known as peristalsis. And this is a progressive wave-like contraction that squeezes food through the GI tract. Okay, so again, I know this is weird, but like, have you ever seen a snake eat something? That's basically what peristalsis is. Okay, so what we're gonna do is with that circular layer, we're gonna be able to squeeze. So again, if this is my tube, I'm able to squeeze so the tube gets smaller in diameter. Okay, and then that longitudinal layer, which is just external here, that longitudinal layer will shorten the tube. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze and shorten at the same time, and that's going to push that food forward. Again, like I said, if you've ever seen a snake eat something, it's the same exact process that we have going on within our digestive tract, and that's what peristalsis actually is. So that's pretty cool, right? So again, you can kind of see those two layers here. And then next we have the serosa, which we know to be the most external of those four layers. And this is the same thing as the visceroperitoneum. Okay, so again, it's going to be the outermost layer. It's formed of a simple squamous epithelium that's going to be down here. So again, it's creating a lubricated surface that's going to prevent any abrasion from this tube as it interacts or like butts up against other organs within the system. Okay. This is a good time for us to talk a little bit about smooth muscle. So again, as you know from our tissues unit, there are three different types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And there isn't really another good place for smooth muscle to kind of fit into our conversations. So I threw it in with the digestive tract because smooth muscle is a huge component of the digestive system. But when we look at what smooth muscle is, where it's located, we can find it in 6 different locations within the body. Number 1, we can find it in the iris of your eyes. So again, it would allow us to dilate or constrict our pupils depending on what the light is going on around us, and also depending on our like attentional focus as well. So again, iris of eyes. Number 2, walls of blood vessels. So again, smooth muscle will allow us to kind of determine where we want to send blood, so we can constrict the vessels or make them smaller through the contraction of the smooth muscle, and that'll prevent blood flow to that particular location. Or we can vasodilate or relax the smooth muscle within a blood vessel, and that'll allow us to increase flow of blood in that particular location. Number 3, respiratory tubes. Again, I can have vasodilation or vasoconstriction of like my bronchial tubes, for example, and that'll allow me to kind of control how much air I'm bringing in. Obviously, as we mentioned, the digestive tubes is another location where we will find smooth muscle, urinary organs as well, and lastly, the reproductive organs. Okay. So smooth muscle fibers are generally grouped in like sheets. So again, they're going to be a smaller cell in comparison to like your skeletal muscle cells or skeletal muscle fibers. Their contraction is slow and sustained. Again, it takes them a while to get activated, but they're very resistant to fatigue. So again, I want you to think about fatigue resistance and why it might be important when we think about the digestive tract. Again, digestion alone could take 6 to 8 hours if you had like a decently large meal. So imagine trying to contract your like skeletal muscles or like doing exercise for 6 to 8 hours, right? That would be exhausting if we did that all the time, right? So it's very important that because we eat every single day, that these smooth muscles need to be resistant to fatigue. So that's very important. So they're going to have a moderate amount of contraction every day without fatiguing. Again, digestion alone could be 6 to 8 hours in nature. Again, takes 30 times longer to contract and relax in comparison to skeletal muscle, but that's not really a huge deal for us because we're not concerned with speed. Like, we're not usually trying to eat as fast as we can and get those nutrients as fast as we can, unless it's like an emergency and we like didn't have food or whatever. But for your average everyday, that's not like a huge priority, so that's fine. But we do need them to be able to sustain, you know, their force for an extended period of time. So that is important to us. When we think about neural innervation as it relates to smooth muscle, again, smooth muscle is involuntary in nature, as you know. So it needs to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system will be like in charge of when smooth muscle is going to contract. Smooth muscle cells can spread a single contraction through gap junctions. So basically, again, imagine that you had a sheet of many cells kind of connected to each other. If I signal or stimulate one of those cells, it's got like these specialized junctions or these gap junctions. Imagine like a bunch of hotel rooms with like the adjoining doors. Imagine that those adjoining doors are all opened. And so therefore I can send a message to each hotel room, which represents one single cell. I can do that really fast, okay? So again, I just need to stimulate really one cell and then I can spread that message pretty easily across the whole sheet, okay? We have myenteric nerve plexus that lies in the muscularis between the two layers of the smooth muscle. So that'll lie between the circular and the longitudinal layers of the smooth muscle. Again, the digestive tract is largely automatic in nature, but it does contain something known as an enteric nervous system. An enteric nervous system basically means that control of digestion itself occurs from its own internal, like it's got its like own internal system, which is pretty cool. So again, the brain isn't really doing a whole lot for the digestive tract. Like, it's just kind of taking care of itself because it's got its own internal system known as an enteric nervous system, okay? Enteric means gut. Okay, so it's got like the gut has a specific nervous system, which is pretty cool. It involves many reflex arcs. So again, these will be very simple reflexes that allow us to digest food as we consume it. Okay, so next let's take a look at the flow of food. Again, we'll kind of go through those in a sequential order, and we'll take a look at what's going on within each of those organs specifically. So it makes most sense to start with the mouth. The mouth is mucosal lined. Again, very important for us as we think about the amount of abrasion that could be faced when we put things into our mouths, right? So again, think about eating Cheetos, for example, or Doritos maybe would be a better example. Again, the edges can be very sharp, so I need to have mucosa in order to not have every single chip like cut through the inside of my mouth, okay? Contains two different sections. So we have a vestibule, which is the spot between your teeth and your lips and cheeks. And I'll show you what that means. And then the oral cavity proper, and this lies internal to your teeth. So oral cavity proper, that's inside of, you know, your mouth. That's like where your tongue lies pretty much. And then when we think about this vestibule, that's like this section like between your teeth and your cheeks and your lips, okay? So like if I were to chew tobacco, for example, I'm gonna put it in my vestibule, okay? So it's gonna go within that particular area. Okay. The lining of the mouth contains a thick stratified squamous epithelium that's gonna help us to protect from abrasion from sharp food pieces like we just mentioned. Again, also think about the amount of acidity that we put into our system. You think about like carbonated beverages, or like I'm a huge spicy fan. So like, you know, consuming jalapenos and buffalo spicy sauce and all that delicious foods, that acidity also causes some abrasion to this layer as well. So it's important that this layer is very thick so that we protect kind of the inner lining of the mouth. Okay. Within the mouth, we have the tongue, which will serve as an accessory organ for us. It's pretty much a muscle. It's going to help us to do a couple different things. It helps with speech, but it also helps to mix food with saliva, and that's going to help us to form something known as a bolus of food before we swallow it. And a bolus of food is basically like just like a little like chunk of food that's been broken down slightly from a mechanical standpoint when you chew with your teeth. And also, you know, adds those salivary enzymes into it. Okay. We have three different types of papillae within the tongue. So we have filiform papillae, and these papillae are going to help to roughen the tongue and enable it to grasp and manipulate food. So again, think of a papillae as like a little bump or like a little mountain, basically. So again, we're talking about those little bumps that are on your tongue. Okay, so filiform is going to roughen the tongue, enable it to grasp and manipulate food. Fungiform papillae are less abundant, but they're going to contain taste buds. And we'll talk in great detail about taste and taste buds in our sensory unit in Anatomy and Phys 2, if you're sticking around for that. And then lastly, we have valate papillae. And these are going to mark the border of the tongue, and they also contain some taste buds. Okay, so here you can see the relationship between those different types of papillae. So again, the filiform papillae here, those filiform papillae again are going to help us roughen the tongue and manipulate food. Next, you can see the, fungiform papillae, which are going to contain taste buds, kind of more centrally located. And then lastly, the valate papillae, which are kind of on this back border of the tongue. And these are going to also contain some particular taste buds. Okay. So let's take a look at our teeth. Again, teeth are going to help us to break down that food from a mechanical standpoint. So again, taking big chunks of food and chopping them down into smaller chunks. So they're going to tear and grind the food, breaking it into smaller fragments. 4 different types of teeth based on their shape and their function. So we have incisors, which are going to nip off food pieces, and they're going to be chisel shaped. Okay. Number 2 is canines, and canines are cone shaped, and they're going to help us to tear and pierce food. We have premolars, which are broad and round, and they're going to help us to grind food. And then we have our molars, which are also broad and round, and these are the best grinders that we have. So let's take a look at an image so that we can kind of get a feel for where these are located. Okay. So again, you can see the incisors are kind of located here right at the front. Canines here slightly lateral. Again, those canines are cone shaped, and they're going to help to tear and pierce. Incisors nip off food, and they're going to be chisel shaped. Then you can see the premolars. Here we go. Premolars down here. Again, those are going to help us to grind food, and the molars, which are the furthest back, are the best grinders for us. Okay. Also within the mouth, we have salivary glands, 3 different types of salivary glands, and they're going to help us to produce saliva. And saliva is a mixture of water, ions, mucus, and enzymes. And it has 4 functions. So the functions of saliva include to moisten the mouth, dissolve food chemicals so that they can be tasted. It begins the digestion of carbohydrates. So carbohydrate digestion actually begins in the mouth. It's the only nutrient that starts its chemical breakdown within the mouth. And then lastly, neutralizes acid. So again, I mentioned, you know, some examples of acidic types of food. Maybe you like Pepsi, maybe you like ketchup, maybe you like spicy foods. Okay, so all of those provide us with some acidity. And so the saliva is going to help us to kind of neutralize that acidity so that you don't experience much unless you have something like super spicy. We don't want to experience that burning sensation as the food moves down the esophagus into the stomach. Okay. 3 glands. Okay, so we have the parotid gland, which is located near the ear. Okay. We have the sublingual gland, which is located here. It's at the base of the tongue, and then submandibular, located just slightly posterior to sublingual. As we chew up our food and it's ready to exit the mouth, it's going to travel into the pharynx. Again, this is going to be lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Muscles involved in swallowing are located here. We have pharyngeal constrictors that are composed of skeletal muscle. So again, we can consciously decide when we want to swallow and not to swallow. So a couple different regions here. So we're going to move from the mouth to the oropharynx, to the laryngopharynx, and then lastly into the esophagus. There's actually another portion of the pharynx that is going to be specific to airflow. So that's going to allow us to move air from the nose into the pharynx, this kind of common region for air and food. Okay, so here you can see, sorry, my picture's a little bit blurry, but if we think about this as it relates to the digestive tract, here's the mouth here, and we're going to swallow the food. It's going to travel through the oropharynx into the laryngopharynx and then into the esophagus. Okay, again, if I were to breathe in air through my nose up here, the air will flow through the nasopharynx, through the oropharynx, through the laryngopharynx, and then into this anterior tube, which is known as the trachea. Okay, so again, these two components of the pharynx are going to serve as a common ground for both bringing air in and out, but also bringing in nutrients, so food and beverages through these pathways. So once we leave the pharynx, we're ready to go into the esophagus. The esophagus is simply a tube that's like in your neck, and it's going to connect the pharynx to the stomach. It joins to the stomach at the cardiac orifice. And there's going to be a sphincter there known as the cardiac sphincter, and that's going to prevent backflow of acidic juices into the esophagus. Okay. When the esophagus is empty, the tube remains folded and collapsed. The tube can open up and the folds go away when food's present. Lots of mucus glands here. Again, we want to lubricate that food as it travels through the esophagus and into the stomach. I'll show you on I think it's the next slide. We'll take a look at that cardiac sphincter. Here we go. So again, here's the esophagus and how it's going to connect with the stomach. That cardiac sphincter would be right along here. Okay, again, it's just a circular muscular layer that's going to prevent the flow of food here and juices from going back up to the esophagus. So if anybody has ever experienced heartburn, for example, basically one of the reasons we might experience heartburn is because that cardiac sphincter isn't closed tightly. And so the acidic molecules, which we'll talk about being found within the stomach, can seep back up into the esophagus and cause a burning sensation. Again, the reason that it's called heartburn is because it's close to where your heart's located. It actually doesn't have anything to do with your heart or the cardiovascular system or anything else like that. But because of where you feel it, it's been termed heartburn, when in reality, it really has nothing to do with the heart. It just has to do with this digestive pathway. So in the stomach, food is transformed from bolus into a chyme. And we're going to start the breakdown of proteins here. Okay, and we're going to start the breakdown of proteins through an enzyme known as pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that's going to break proteins down into amino acids. So again, remember we said that a protein was like a strand of beads, and each amino acid represents one single bead. So we're going to use this enzyme to start breaking down that long chain into single beads. Okay. Only functions in an acidic environment. So again, as I mentioned, this organ is very acidic in nature. Okay. Let's check out the anatomy associated with the stomach. So I have a cardiac region, which is here right at the entry of, excuse me, of the stomach. Okay. You can see the fundus, which is right here. The fundus creates the stomach's dome, essentially. Pylorus is known as the gatekeeper. So pylorus, you can see here, we have a pyloric sphincter, which is going to prevent food from flowing from the stomach into the small intestine. So again, it's going to move from the stomach into the duodenum, or this section of the small intestines. We also have a lesser curvature, which is on this side, and then the greater curvature over here on this side. One other thing to note that you can see here are the rugae of the mucosa. So again, these are like folds or wrinkles in the stomach, and these will get flattened out once the stomach is filled. So again, as I eat a large meal, those wrinkles kind of flatten out, and that'll allow the stomach to expand. Okay. When we zoom in a little bit further, we can take a look at microscopic components of anatomy, and there are several different types of cells. So let's take a look at what the functions are of each of these cells. So the mucous neck cells are going to secrete mucus. Again, it's very important that we secrete mucus basically throughout the entire lining of the digestive tract, because we don't want any abrasion to occur. Next, we have the parietal cells, and these are going to secrete something known as hydrochloric acid, and this is going to help to create an acidic environment for the breakdown of protein. So again, we said that the stomach is very acidic in nature, and those parietal cells are going to contribute huge in order for us to create that acidic environment. Next, we have chief cells, and those chief cells are going to create and release pepsinogen, which is then going to be converted into pepsin. Again, pepsin, as we just talked about on the previous slide, is important for the breakdown of proteins. Enteroendocrine cells here are going to secrete hormones. One hormone that they secrete in specific is gastrin, and this is going to signal up to the parietal cells to tell the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid. Okay, so these enteroendocrine cells are located in the pyloric region of the stomach. So right when food enters into the stomach, they're like, hey, parietal cells, it's time for us to create some this acidic environment. Why don't you go ahead and make some hydrochloric acids, because I've got a bunch of food coming in. Okay. And then lastly, we have these undifferentiated stem cells, and these are going to help us to replace the stomach lining. And reproduction of the stomach lining, get this, we finish the inside of our stomach every 3 to 7 days. Isn't that crazy? And the reason for that is this acidic environment that's created via these parietal cells is extremely tough to live in, right? So again, we're constantly reproducing the inner layer of the stomach because of the acidic environment that's necessary in order for us to break down the food. All right. On to small intestines. Okay, let me move my, let's see, how about right there? So again, as we move out of the stomach, we're headed into the small intestines. We'll move through the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So those are the 3 different components, okay? Small intestines contains 3 different types of cells here. So we have absorptive cells. These are going to help us to absorb the nutrients. So again, we think about absorption. We're going to move those nutrients from inside of the digestive tract to into the bloodstream so that we can use them as energy. We also have some goblet cells, which are going to help with the breakdown of fats. And then we also have these enteroendocrine cells, and this is going to secrete hormones that signal gallbladder and pancreas to release their enzymes to assist with breakdown of both fats and carbohydrates and proteins as well. Okay, next we're moving on to the large intestines. There's very little digestion occurring here. The small intestines is the primary location for absorption of our nutrients. So again, that movement of the nutrients that we're going to keep from inside the digestive tract to into the bloodstream so that we can use them within the body. Like I said, little digestion actually occurs in the large intestines. If you make it to the large intestines, you're probably going to get excreted as a waste. We do have some water movement within the large intestines, so some water secretion or absorption can occur here. So again, we'll see the small intestines connect here to the ascending colon. Then we're going to come across to the transverse colon, down to the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then lastly out the rectum. Okay, when we look at the anal canal or the rectum, again, that sigmoid colon is going to connect with the rectum. Again, it contains a longitudinal muscle layer, which would allow us to shorten that tube in order to have kind of this peristalsis mechanism occurring. We also have an internal and external anal sphincter. Internal anal sphincter is going to be made of smooth muscle, and the external anal sphincter is made of skeletal muscle. So again, this external anal sphincter allows us to have control over when we decide we want to get rid of this waste. Again, when we potty train kids, we're trying to teach them how to control this external anal sphincter. Okay, so again, you're not necessarily born with that skill, I guess. And so, you know, as they get to 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, we're training them to understand when is appropriate for them to relax this particular sphincter. But basically, as you know, that waste product presses or creates pressure on this internal anal sphincter, that's when you know, like, okay, well, I have to go to the bathroom. And then, like I said, you decide when you activate this skeletal muscle sphincter, the external. Okay. So that pretty much takes us through the whole digestive tract. Next, we're going to take a look at some of those accessory organs. So 3 organs to kind of take a look at here. We can see the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Liver here, gallbladder, super small little green thing associated with the liver. And then lastly, the pancreas, you can see kind of inferior to the liver. Pancreas really secretes 2 major hormones. It's going to secrete insulin and glucagon. Also can secrete many digestive enzymes as well. It's innervated by the thoracic, splenic nerve, and vagus nerve. Okay, again, notice that it's close to the gallbladder as well. Again, when we think about the hormones, what's the role of insulin? What's the role of glucagon? Insulin, again, is going to help us to take sugars out of the blood and put them into a cell so that they can be stored. And glucagon is going to do the opposite. Glucagon is going to help us to get sugars out of storage and put them into the bloodstream. Okay, so again, I'm going to release insulin when my blood sugar levels are high, such as when I eat a meal. And I'm going to release glucagon when my blood sugar levels get low, such as, you know, between meals, okay, once I've used up all that fuel that I had for lunch today or whatever. The gallbladder is pretty simple, actually. The gallbladder is just like this little kind of sac, and basically it's just going to serve as a storage pocket for bile. So the liver is going to produce bile, and then it's going to store that bile within the gallbladder. And what do we need bile for? Bile is used for the digestion of fats. And so when I consume fats, the gallbladder will release some bile, and that bile will travel into the duodenum of the small intestines, and that'll allow me to break down some of that fat. Okay. The liver is freaking cool. The liver is the largest gland in the body. It weighs over 3 pounds, and it can perform over 500 different functions. So it's super important for us as it relates to metabolism, digestion, those types of issues. Really, it's really important in processing of foods and things like that. One other cool thing about the liver is, like, let's say I had half of this get chopped off, it'll actually regenerate itself. So that's freaking cool that this organ can do that. Again, as I mentioned, it's very important for processing, or processing the 3 macronutrients. So fats, proteins, and carbohydrates will all be modified in some type of way within the liver. Can also serve as a storage site for glycogen. So again, that storage form of carbohydrates. And then it also can produce bile, as we mentioned, that'll then be stored in that gallbladder, which is going to assist with fat breakdown. 2 other things to kind of point out here. We do have a round ligament, which can be seen kind of separating the right lobe and the left lobe of the liver. And this round ligament is actually remnants of your umbilical cord. So this was originally how you received food and nutrients and that sort of thing from mom. Okay. We also have this falciform ligament here. And this attaches the liver to the anterior side of the body. So again, think about this like 3-pound thing just like jiggling around in there. Like, we want to have it kind of anchored to something. So that's important as well. Okay. Next, we'll move on to a couple digestive disorders. So again, a peptic ulcer, again, we think about, I mentioned that acidity within the stomach, and that acidity can become too much, and that can cause an ulcer, can cause a burning sensation 1 to 3 hours post-meal. It's caused by oversecretion of that hydrochloric acid, and it can cause inflammation as well. I've heard they can be extremely painful, but again, that's what's going on if you had a peptic ulcer. And we have viral hepatitis. Again, this is going to be inflammation of the liver, and this will produce some flu-like symptoms. Hep A is often comes from contaminated food or water. Hep B, transmitted by infection of blood or body fluids, may cause chronic liver disease if not treated. And then Hep C, transmitted by blood or body fluids, with no short-term symptoms, but again, it's difficult to diagnose. May have it for 20 years before you even know you have it, so that's kind of crazy. But again, essentially what we're looking at with any of these types of hepatitis are an inflammation of the liver. All right, peeps, that is it for the digestive tract. Let me know if you have specific questions on any of that information, and I hope you have a great day.